The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Elena Voss heard the scream. She was walking home from the night shift at St. Agnes Hospital, her sneakers soaked through, her scrub jacket doing nothing against the cold that came off the Kestrel River in sheets. It was past midnight. The streetlights along the embankment flickered weakly, and the water below roared louder than usual, swollen and black and furious from the storm. She almost didn't hear it over the rain. A splash. A choking cry, cut short. Elena stopped walking. Every instinct her mother had drilled into her. Mind your business, girl. This city eats curious people, told her to keep moving. But 6 years of nursing had trained a different instinct into her, one that ran deeper than fear. If someone was drowning, you did not stand on the bank and think about it. She dropped her bag and ran to the railing. A dark shape thrashed in the current about 20 feet from shore, arms flailing weakly, going under, coming up, going under again. Whoever it was had maybe one more surface before the river took them for good. Elena didn't think. She kicked off her shoes, swung her legs over the rusted railing, and jumped. The cold hit her like a wall of nails. For a moment the world was noise and black water, and the terrifying disorientation of not knowing which way was up. Then her training took over. She'd done open water rescue certification years ago, back when she still thought she might join search and rescue instead of settling into hospital shifts, and she kicked hard toward the place she'd last seen the shape. "Hey," she shouted, swallowing water. "Hey, I'm coming. Stop fighting it. Let the current help you." A hand closed around her wrist with surprising strength for someone drowning. She used the leverage, spun behind him, hooked her arm across his chest the way she'd been trained, and started kicking sideways, cutting across the current instead of fighting it head-on. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight in places, then suddenly fighting again, panicked, which was the most dangerous thing a drowning person could do to their rescuer. Elena had seen it happen, good swimmers pulled under by the very people they tried to save. "Stop fighting me," she gasped into his ear, water in her mouth. "I've got you. Trust me or we both go under." Something in her voice must have reached him, because he stilled. Not relaxed. She could feel the tension in every line of his body, but he stopped thrashing, and that was enough. It took almost 10 minutes to fight their way to a shallow bend downstream where the bank sloped instead of dropping straight into deep water. By the time her knees hit gravel, Elena's arms had gone past, aching into a kind of numb fire, and her lungs burned like she'd swallowed glass. She dragged him the last few feet onto the mud and collapsed beside him, coughing up river water, shaking so hard her teeth clattered. For a moment neither of them moved. Then he rolled onto his side, retching, and she heard him drag in a long, ragged breath, the good kind, the kind that meant a person was going to live. "You're okay," she managed. "You're okay. Just breathe." He didn't answer right away. When he finally lifted his head, the street lamp at the top of the embankment threw just enough light for her to see him properly for the first time. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, a face maybe 30 years old, sharp-boned and pale with cold, and eyes that were watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with almost dying. "Why," he said, voice rough and low, "would you do that?" It wasn't quite a question. Elena blinked at him, still shivering. "Do what? Save your life? Would you have preferred I didn't? You don't know who I am." "I know you were drowning," she said. That was enough information for me. He stared at her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then, absurdly, impossibly, given that they were both half dead on a muddy riverbank in the pouring rain, he laughed. It was a short, disbelieving sound, but real. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena." She hesitated, then added, "Because manners didn't die just because you nearly drowned. Elena Voss." "Dante," he said. And then, after a beat that felt oddly deliberate, "Dante Marchetti." The name meant nothing to her. Not that night. She found out 3 days later, and it was not from him. Elena was restocking supplies in the ER when she overheard 2 orderlies talking in low, excited voices near the nurse's station. "I'm telling you it was him. Marchetti. The Marchetti. Half the East Side belongs to that family. No way he almost drowned. Guys like that don't drown, they get pulled out by helicopter." "That's what I heard." fell off the Kestrel Bridge during the storm. Some woman jumped in after him. Nobody knows who. Elena's hands went still on the box of gauze she was holding. Fell off the bridge. She hadn't asked him how he ended up in the water. She'd been too busy trying to keep them both alive, and afterward, an ambulance she hadn't called had arrived with unsettling speed, and 2 men in dark coats had lifted him away with brisk efficiency, thanking her in clipped voices, refusing to let her ride along, refusing to give her any information at all. She'd walked home alone, soaked and shaking, and told herself it didn't matter. She'd done the job. That was enough. Except apparently the job had a name. And the name belonged to a man that half her city seemed to whisper about the way people whisper about weather that might turn violent. She looked up Dante Marchetti on her phone during her break, in the break room, with the door shut. The photographs were mostly grainy. A man in dark tailored coats getting out of cars, flanked by other men, never quite smiling for the camera. News articles used careful language. Alleged organized crime figure, reputed head of the Marchetti family, under investigation but never charged. One older article, from 6 years back, mentioned his father's death in what the paper delicately called a business dispute, and Dante's abrupt rise to head the family at 26. There was nothing about a wife. Nothing about him smiling in any photo she could find. Elena sat with her phone in her lap for a long time, her tea going cold beside her, and thought, I pulled a Mafia boss out of a river with my bare hands. She thought that would be the end of it. A strange, frightening footnote to an otherwise ordinary week. She went back to her shift. She treated a broken arm, an asthma attack, an elderly man having a quiet, dignified heart attack that she and Dr. Amare managed to catch in time. She went home and slept for 11 hours and told herself the whole episode belonged in the past. He found her 5 days later, waiting outside the hospital's staff entrance at the end of her shift, wearing a black coat that made him look like something cut from the night itself, flanked by no one this time. Just him, standing very still under the awning, out of the rain that had finally, mercifully, stopped. You knew, Elena said, before he could speak. You knew who you were the whole time, and you let me think you were just some guy who fell in the river. I was some guy who fell in the river, Dante said. That part was true. Fell, she repeated flatly. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, wry and tired. There's a version of the story where I fell. I'd advise you not to ask for the other version. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to keep you safe. He studied her, that same unsettling intensity from the riverbank. I came to say thank you, properly, and to tell you that you should forget my name, forget my face, and never mention that night to anyone. Elena crossed her arms, cold suddenly, though it wasn't the weather. Is that a threat? It's a favor, Dante said quietly. The people who put me in that river are not the kind of people who forgive loose ends. If they learn a nurse named Elena Voss pulled me out and knows my name, that nurse becomes a loose end too. The break room fluorescence, the newspaper photos, the words alleged and reputed, all of it clicked into a colder, sharper shape in her mind. He wasn't warning her about himself. He was warning her about someone else. Someone who'd tried to kill him and might try again, and might not particularly care who got caught in the current a second time. Okay, Elena said slowly. Consider your name forgotten. Dante nodded once, like a man closing a ledger. He turned to go. Wait, she said, and hated herself a little for it. Is someone actually going to come after you again? He looked back at her, rain-dark eyes unreadable in the sodium light. Probably, he said. That's rather the point of my life, Ms. Voss. Go home. Lock your door. He was gone before she could answer, swallowed into a black car that had pulled up so silently she hadn't noticed it idling at the curb. She locked her door that night. She locked it the night after that too. It should have ended there. It might have if the world worked the way Elena wanted it to. Instead, 2 weeks later, a bouquet of white ranunculus arrived at the nurse's station with no card, and the woman who delivered it, polite, watchful, dressed too well to be an ordinary florist, asked specifically for Elena Voss before leaving without another word. A month after that, A man came into the ER with a stab wound to the shoulder, refusing to give his name, refusing police involvement, paying cash, and when Elena went to update his chart, she found a folded note tucked beneath the clipboard. He asked me to make sure you were the one who saw him.
D.
She should have reported it. She should have told hospital security, or the police, or at the very least her supervisor, that a known, alleged, crime boss appeared to be having his people watch out for her, sending flowers, orchestrating small collisions between her shifts and his associates like a man leaving breadcrumbs. She didn't. She told herself it was because nothing illegal had actually happened. She told herself a lot of things. The truth arrived on a Tuesday in October, when Dante Marchetti walked into St. Agnes's ER on his own two legs, gray with pain, one hand pressed to a wound in his side that was bleeding through a jacket that had clearly cost more than Elena's monthly rent, and said only one thing to the intake nurse before his knees buckled. Get Elena Voss. Chaos took the ER the way it always did, fast, loud, controlled by people trained to be calm inside emergencies. Elena was 3 rooms over stitching a child's split eyebrow when she heard her name shouted down the hall, heard gunshot wound, hypotensive, get a trauma bay, and something in her chest went cold and certain before she even saw him. She found him on the gurney, shirt cut away, blood soaking the sheet beneath him, Dr. Amare already barking orders, 2 of Dante's men standing rigid by the doorway with guns barely concealed under their coats, daring anyone to make them leave. Out. Elena snapped at them, in the voice she used for panicking families, the one that left no room for argument. Both of you now, or I call security and this whole floor goes into lockdown. They looked at Dante. He managed, through gritted teeth, a single word. Go. They went. Elena worked. She didn't let herself think about who he was, what he'd done to earn a bullet in his side, what would happen to her career or her safety for being the nurse of record on a mob boss's chart. She thought about blood pressure and packing and the location of the wound relative to his liver, and she worked with Dr. Amare in the tight, wordless synchrony of people who trusted each other completely, and somewhere in the middle of it Dante's hand found her wrist and gripped it, hard, grounding himself against the pain. You again, he rasped, teeth chattering with shock. Seems to be a pattern. Don't talk, Elena said. Save it. Elena. I said don't talk, Marchetti. But her voice cracked on his name, just slightly, and his fingers tightened on her wrist as if he'd heard it too. They got him stable. It took 4 units of blood and 40 minutes and every ounce of skill in that trauma bay, but they got him stable, and when it was over Elena stood in the hallway outside recovery with her scrubs soaked through for the second time in her life because of this man, and let herself shake. Dr. Amare found her there. He was 60 years old, gray at the temples, and had seen enough in 30 years of ER medicine that very little surprised him anymore. You know who that is, he said. Not a question. Yes. You won't explain why he asked for you by name. Elena looked at her hands. I pulled him out of the river in July. I didn't know who he was. I still don't really know what I've gotten pulled into. Dr. Amare studied her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, put a steadying hand on her shoulder. Whatever this is, he said, be careful. Men like that don't have ordinary lives, and they don't let the people around them have ordinary lives either. I've seen it before. It doesn't end gently. There's nothing to be careful about, Elena said. I'm his nurse. That's all. Dr. Amare's look said he didn't quite believe her. She wasn't sure she believed herself. She checked on him that night, after her shift technically ended, telling herself it was professional diligence and nothing more. Dante was awake, propped against the pillows, pale but alert, his eyes finding her the moment she stepped through the door as if he'd been waiting. You should be resting, she said, checking his monitors out of habit. I should be a lot of things, Dante said. Thank you. Again. This is becoming an unfortunate habit. You keep almost dying near me. I'd call that more than a habit. She adjusted his foreline, careful not to meet his eyes for too long. Who shot you? His jaw tightened. Someone who wants what's mine. Which is? Everything, he said simply. My territory. My contracts. My life, apparently, given tonight's events. He watched her steadily. You have every right to walk out of this room and never speak to me again, Elena. I would understand it. I would, if I'm honest, recommend it. Why? Because I attract violence the way the river attracts rain. Because everyone who gets close to me becomes a target the moment my enemies notice they exist. Because I fell off that bridge in July not by accident, and the people who push me are not going to stop until one of us is dead, and I would very much prefer that it isn't you who gets caught in the crossfire, because you were kind to me twice. There was something raw in his voice that she hadn't expected, not the cold, controlled menace she'd read about in newspaper articles, but something closer to exhaustion, closer to loneliness. Why me? Elena asked quietly. Why did you ask for me tonight? Out of every hospital in this city? Dante was quiet for a long moment. Then, because you're the only person who's touched me in 6 years who wasn't trying to use me, kill me, or profit from me. You didn't know my name when you jumped. That means more to me than I know how to say. The room was very quiet. Outside, machines beeped their steady rhythm, and somewhere down the hall a gurney wheel squeaked, and Elena stood very still, feeling something shift in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. I have to finish my rounds, she said finally, because it was easier than saying anything true. Of course, Dante said, and something in his voice, resigned, gentle, entirely unlike what she'd expected from a man half the city feared, made her pause at the door. I'll check on you before I leave, she said. The smile he gave her then was small and real, and it undid something in her that she wasn't sure she'd ever get put back together the same way. Over the following weeks, while Dante recovered under guard in a private wing that his money had quietly arranged, Elena found herself drawn back to his room more often than her rotations strictly required. She told herself it was curiosity. She told herself it was because Dr. Amare had asked her to monitor his recovery, given her familiarity with the case. She told herself several things, and none of them fully explained the way her pulse changed when she saw his name on the day's patient list, or the way conversations with him stretched from clinical check-ins into something longer, quieter, and far more dangerous to her peace of mind. She learned things she hadn't expected. That he read poetry, actual poetry, dense and old, and kept a battered volume of Rilke on his nightstand that one of his men had brought from his apartment. That he'd wanted, as a boy, to be an architect, before his father's death had rerouted his entire life into something colder and more violent than he'd ever chosen for himself. That he did not enjoy the empire he ran so much as endure it, the way a man endures a debt he can't outrun. Then why not leave it? She asked him one evening, when the ward was quiet and his guards had, for once, allowed her in unaccompanied. Dante laughed, low and without much humor. You don't leave families like mine, Elena. You die in them, or you die trying to leave them. There isn't a third option, no matter what the movies tell you. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have. He looked at her, and the guardedness that usually lived behind his eyes softened, just slightly. There are 400 people whose livelihoods depend on the organization staying intact and staying under someone who isn't a monster. My father was a monster. I've spent 6 years trying to be something else while keeping us all alive. If I walk away, someone worse takes my place, and a great many people who never asked for any of this suffer for it. Elena sat with that for a long moment. It didn't excuse the violence. She wasn't naive enough to think a man in his position had clean hands, but it complicated the simple, monstrous shape she'd built of him from newspaper clippings and complication she was beginning to understand was the most dangerous thing about Dante Marchetti. It was much easier to keep her distance from a monster than from a man trying, however imperfectly, to be less than one. You're looking at me differently, Dante observed. I'm trying not to, Elena admitted. Why? Because you're a patient. And because whatever's happening between the lines of these conversations is a very bad idea for both of us. She met his eyes, made herself hold them. Your enemies already know my name, don't they? That's why you keep sending guards and flowers and notes. You're not protecting a stranger anymore, Dante. You're protecting someone they think matters to you. The silence that followed told her she was right before he said a word. Yes, Dante said finally, quietly. They know. And I am sorry for that, more than I can tell you. I never meant to put you in danger. I only meant to say thank you. I don't seem to have managed either very gracefully. It happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the shooting, when Elena was walking to her car after a double shift, exhausted in the particular bone-deep way that made a person careless. She heard the footsteps too late. A hand closed over her mouth before she could scream, an arm hard around her waist dragging her toward the mouth of the alley beside the parking structure, and for one terrifying, suspended second Elena thought, absurdly, this can't be happening. I'm a nurse, I fix people, this doesn't happen to people like me. And then training and instinct collided, and she drove her elbow back into her attacker's ribs with everything she had, twisted free enough to scream once, sharp and loud, before the hand clamped down again. Headlights flooded the alley. A car door. Footsteps running, fast and precise, and then her attacker was gone from around her, thrown bodily against the brick wall by someone she recognized even in the dark and the panic. One of Dante's men, the quiet one called Salvo, who'd been posted outside Dante's hospital room for weeks. "Are you hurt?" Salvo demanded, gun already leveled at the man crumpled against the wall, who was groaning and trying to crawl away. No, I don't think so." Elena's voice came out shaking. Her legs didn't feel entirely like her own. Salvo said something sharp into a phone Elena hadn't seen him produce, something in rapid, low Italian. And within minutes 2 more cars had arrived, and the man who'd grabbed her was being dragged into one of them, and Elena stood in the parking structure with her arms wrapped around herself, shaking, trying to process that she had very nearly been taken, or killed, or worse, because a man she'd pulled out of a river 4 months ago had decided to thank her too warmly. Dante arrived 20 minutes later, moving like a man who'd run every red light in the city to get there, and the look on his face when he saw her standing unhurt but shaking was something Elena would remember for a long time. Not relief exactly, or not only relief, but something closer to a man staring at the edge of a catastrophe he'd narrowly avoided causing. "I'm so sorry," he said, and his voice broke slightly on the word sorry, unpolished in a way she'd never heard from him. "I should have pulled security around you the moment they learned your name. I was arrogant. I thought if I kept my distance, kept things professional, it would protect you. I was wrong, and you nearly paid for my mistake." "Who was he?" Elena said. Her teeth were chattering, though the night wasn't cold. "The man who grabbed me. Someone working for the Castellano family," Dante said grimly. "They've wanted my territory for 2 years. Now they've decided the way to hurt me is to hurt you." He stepped closer, hands hovering as though he wanted to touch her and didn't trust himself to. "Elena, I need you to hear me clearly. You are not safe anymore simply by association with me, and I cannot undo that now that it's happened. I can only offer you protection or distance, and I need you to choose, because I won't force either one on you." Elena looked at him, at the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with his own safety, at the guilt sitting heavy on his shoulders, at the 4 months of small kindnesses and careful visits and half-admitted feelings that had brought them to this alley, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that walking away from him now would not actually make her safe. It would only mean facing whatever came next alone. "Protection," she said. "I choose protection. And I choose you telling me the truth. All of it, from now on. No more notes. No more half-answers. If I'm going to be in danger because of you, I want to know exactly why." Something in Dante's face cracked open, relief and fear, and something that looked, for just a moment, like the beginning of hope. "All right," he said quietly. "All right. Come with me. I'll tell you everything." They sat in the back of his car, Salvo driving them through streets Elena didn't recognize toward a townhouse she'd never have guessed belonged to a man like Dante, modest, quiet, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of place designed to be forgotten. Inside, over tea that Dante made himself, badly, in a kitchen that looked barely used, he told her everything. He told her about his father, a violent man who had built the Marchetti organization on fear and kept it running on more of the same, and about the night 6 years ago when a rival family had killed him in a restaurant in front of Dante, 26 years old and utterly unprepared to become what his father's death demanded he become. He told her about the years since, the slow, careful work of pulling the organization's income away from the worst of its old business, funneling it instead into construction, shipping, real estate, things that could one day, he hoped, become entirely legitimate if he lived long enough to finish the work. He told her about the enemies that transition had made him, men who preferred the old, bloodier ways and saw his reforms as weakness. He told her about the bridge, that he had not fallen, that a lieutenant he'd trusted for a decade had turned on him at the Castellano family's price, had driven him to the middle of the bridge under the pretense of a meeting and put a gun to his back and told him to jump or be shot, and that he had chosen the river because a bullet was certain and a swollen storm current was not. "I didn't expect to survive," Dante admitted, staring into his tea, not drinking it. "I'm not a strong swimmer. I made my peace with drowning somewhere around the 3rd minute. And then there was a hand on my collar and a voice telling me to stop fighting the current, and I thought, absurdly, given the circumstances, that I'd rather live, after all, if it meant finding out who that voice belonged to." Elena sat very still, her tea cooling untouched in her hands, absorbing the shape of a life so entirely unlike her own that she wasn't sure, even now, how to hold it. "The lieutenant who betrayed you," she said finally. "What happened to him?" "He's dead," Dante said, without inflection, without apology. "That is the world I live in, Elena. I won't pretend otherwise to make myself more palatable to you. People who try to kill me do not generally get a second chance to try again." It should have frightened her more than it did. Perhaps it did frighten her, somewhere underneath the strange, steady calm that had settled over her since the alley, the calm of a person who has already decided something important and is simply waiting to hear herself say it out loud. "I'm not going to pretend I understand your world," Elena said slowly, "or that I'm comfortable with everything in it. I'm a nurse, Dante. I spend my life trying to keep people alive, all people, no exceptions, and the idea of a life where death is just a tool, a consequence, something dispensed as easily as a verdict, that's not a world I know how to live in easily." "I know," Dante said quietly. "But I also know what I felt on that riverbank, before I knew your name or your family or any of this. And I know what I've felt every time I've walked into your room these past weeks, even when I told myself it was only professional concern. I'm not going to lie to you about that, even though it terrifies me." She met his eyes. "So don't ask me to choose between protection and distance again. I already told you. I choose to stay. I want to understand what that means before I decide anything more than that, but I'm not running." Dante set down his tea with careful, deliberate control, as though he didn't quite trust his hands. "Elena," he said low, "you should know that if you stay, even as far as this, even just staying near enough to be protected, the Castellanos will read it as exactly what it's becoming. They will not distinguish between a nurse who saved my life out of decency and a woman I've come to care for beyond reason. To them, you'll be a target either way. I need you to understand that fully before you decide anything." "I understand," Elena said. And then, quieter, more honest than she'd meant to be, "I think I decided already, Dante. Somewhere back on that riverbank, if I'm honest. I just didn't know what I was deciding yet." The look he gave her then, stripped of all its careful control, naked with something that looked very much like love, though neither of them said the word, stayed with her long after Salvo drove her home that night under armed escort, long after she lay awake in her locked apartment turning the whole impossible evening over and over in her mind. The weeks that followed were unlike any Elena had lived before. There was a new normal now, a guard rotating outside her apartment that she pretended not to notice on her way to work, a driver who materialized whenever her shift ended late, small kindnesses arriving with a discretion that felt less like surveillance and more, gradually, like care. Dante called every evening, sometimes only for a few minutes, sometimes long enough that she fell asleep with the phone still warm against her ear, listening to him read Rilke in a low voice that made even German poetry and translation sound like something dangerous and beautiful. She met his world slowly, in careful doses. A dinner with Salvo and 2 other men who guarded him, gruff and watchful at first, warming to her by the second course when she made Salvo laugh. Actually laugh, a rare and startling sound, over a story about a patient who'd tried to leave the ER against medical advice while still attached to 3-4 lines. A visit to the modest offices where Dante conducted the legitimate side of his business, watching him negotiate a construction contract with the same careful, controlled intensity he brought to everything, and understanding, watching him, that the man beneath the reputation was someone trying very hard to build something worth being proud of, out of materials that had never been meant for anything but ruin. She learned to recognize the moments when the other Dante surfaced, the one the newspapers wrote about, cold and precise and frightening, usually only in brief flashes, when a phone call came in that made his jaw tighten, when Salvo reported something in a low voice that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. She did not ask questions in those moments. She understood, without being told, that there were parts of his life that would remain closed to her, not out of secrecy toward her specifically, but because some doors, once opened, could not be closed again, and he was trying imperfectly but genuinely to keep as many of those doors shut as he could. "Do you ever think about leaving all of it?" she asked him one night, lying beside him on the small balcony of his townhouse, looking out over a city that neither of them entirely belonged to in the same way anymore. "Every day," Dante said. "I think about it every single day. I have men working on it, moving the last of our income into legitimate channels, cutting ties with the parts of the organization that can't be redeemed. It's slow. It's dangerous. Men have died trying to make less ambitious changes than the ones I'm making, and I know that. But I think about it every day, Elena, because for the first time in 6 years, I have a reason to want to survive it." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and there was nothing careful or controlled in his expression at all. "I love you," Dante said, simply, like a man laying down a weapon he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its weight. "I loved you before I understood it was allowed to call it that. I loved you on that riverbank, half drowned and certain I was dying, thinking that if this was the last face I ever saw, I could live with that. I love you now, knowing exactly what loving me will cost you, and I am sorry for that cost, and I am selfish enough to want you to stay anyway." "I love you too," Elena said, and the words came easier than she'd expected, true in a way that startled her with its simplicity. "God help me, I do. I didn't ask for any of this, the danger, the guards, the double life. But I don't want to imagine my life without you in it anymore, Dante. That ship sailed somewhere in that river, I think, and I've stopped trying to swim back." He kissed her then, slow and certain, and for one suspended moment the danger and the darkness and the impossible weight of his world fell away, and there was only the two of them, and the city lights, and a love that had begun in the worst possible way, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, had become the truest thing in either of their lives. The peace did not last, because peace never lasted long in Dante's world, and Elena had known that from the beginning even as she'd chosen to stay anyway. It began with a message, not a note this time, but a photograph, delivered to Elena's apartment door in a plain envelope with no return address. It showed her, unmistakably her, walking to her car outside the hospital, a red circle drawn crudely around her figure, and a single line of text beneath. "We know who matters to you now, Marchetti. Choose your territory or choose her." Elena's hands shook as she called Dante, and by the time he arrived at her apartment less than 15 minutes later, she had never seen him so still, so lethally focused, all the careful gentleness of the past weeks folded away beneath something colder and older. "This ends now," Dante said, studying the photograph with an expression Elena had never seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of final, exhausted resolve. "I have spent 6 years trying to end this war without more bloodshed than necessary. The Castellanos have made it clear that patience reads to them as weakness. So be it. Dante, I need you to listen to me," he said, turning to her, and his voice was gentler now, though his eyes hadn't lost their coldness. "I am going to end this one way or another, and I need you safe while I do it. Not guarded, Elena, safe, somewhere they cannot reach you, somewhere even I don't know the address of until it's over. You're asking me to disappear. I'm asking you to survive," Dante said. "For a matter of days, not longer. I promise you that. I have a plan that has been in motion for months, long before that photograph arrived at your door, and this." He held up the envelope, jaw tight. "This only tells me it's time to finish it." Elena wanted to argue. Every instinct in her, The same instinct that had sent her over that railing into the river in July, wanted to stay, to fight, to refuse to be tucked away like something fragile while the man she loved walked into danger without her. But she had also spent enough weeks in his world now to understand something crucial, that her staying would not help him. It would only give the Castellanos a second target to worry about protecting, a second vulnerability to exploit.
Days, she said.
Not longer.
And you call me.
Every single day, or I will personally hunt you down, Mafia boss or not. For the first time since the photograph had arrived, something like his usual smile flickered across Dante's face. I would expect nothing less, he said, and kissed her once, hard and certain, before Salvo arrived to take her somewhere neither of them would name aloud. The safe house was a modest cabin 2 hours outside the city, guarded discreetly by 2 men Elena didn't recognize, stocked with enough supplies to last a month and absolutely no television or reliable phone signal, which she suspected was deliberate. The days passed with an agonizing slowness that reminded her of overnight shifts in the ER during the quiet hours before dawn, when time seemed to stretch and thin, and every minute felt like it might snap. Dante called each evening as promised, his voice controlled, giving her nothing she could use to worry more than she already did, only enough to know he was alive, that the plan, whatever it was proceeding. On the 4th night, the call didn't come. Elena sat by the cabin's single working phone line until well past midnight, watching the silent instrument as though staring hard enough might make it ring, cataloging every possible catastrophe with the clinical, unsparing precision of someone trained to imagine the worst so she could prepare for it. She did not sleep. She sat wrapped in a blanket at the kitchen table, and when dawn finally broke gray and cold over the tree line, she had made a decision that she knew, even as she made it, was almost certainly foolish. She was not going to sit in a cabin not knowing if the man she loved was alive. She found one of the guards, a young man named Teo who looked barely old enough to be trusted with the responsibility he'd clearly been given, and told him, with his same firm, no-argument voice she used on panicking patients, that she needed to go back to the city. Mr. Marchetti was very clear, Teo said, alarmed. You're supposed to stay here until... Mr. Marchetti did not check in last night, Elena said. If something has happened to him, I am not going to find out secondhand from a phone call that never comes. I'm a nurse, Teo. If he's hurt, he needs me, and I am not going to sit here and wait to find out whether I'll ever see him again. It took 20 minutes of arguing, and in the end it was not Teo's persuasion but a phone call, finally, mercifully, a phone call, that resolved things. It was Salvo's voice, tight with exhaustion, and something that might have been relief. He's alive, Salvo said, before Elena could even ask. It's over, Elena. The Castellanos are finished. Their leadership is in custody, their operation dismantled. He's hurt, not critically, but he's asking for you. I'm sending a car. She found him in a hospital that was not her own, one of the private facilities his organization quietly kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation, sitting up in bed with a bandaged shoulder and a face that looked 10 years older than it had 4 days ago, and lit, the moment he saw her in the doorway, with an expression of such pure relief that it nearly undid her composure entirely. You were supposed to call, she said, crossing the room in 3 strides, hands already moving over him with the brisk, professional efficiency of a nurse checking for damage, though her eyes were wet. I was in surgery when I would have called, Dante said, catching her hand and holding it against his chest, over the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. I'm sorry. I know what that silence must have cost you. It cost me 4 years off my life, Elena said, and I want a full accounting of everything that happened, and I want it now, and then I never want you to disappear on me again. He told her, a raid coordinated with a federal task force he'd been quietly feeding information to for over a year, part of the long, careful work of dismantling the criminal architecture around him from the inside, a final confrontation with the Castellano leadership that had gone violently wrong before it went right, a bullet that had come far closer to his heart than his careful, understated retelling suggested. It was, Elena understood as she listened, the end of something, not merely a war between families, but the end of the version of Dante's life that had made a war like this possible in the first place. What happens now? she asked when he'd finished, her fingers still laced with his. Now, Dante said, the organization that's left is smaller, cleaner, and answerable to people who don't operate the way the Castellanos did. It's not perfect. It will never be perfect. I've made my peace with that. But it's closer to something I could imagine you standing beside without flinching, and that matters to me more than anything else I've built. Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the bandages, the exhaustion, the careful hope in his eyes, and thought about the river, and the flowers with no card, and the note tucked under a clipboard, and every impossible, dangerous, beautiful turn that had brought them to this hospital room. I never flinched, she said quietly. Not once. Not from the start. I know, Dante said. It's the reason I fell in love with you in the first place. The wedding was small, by necessity and by choice. A garden ceremony at the townhouse. No press, a guest list built more of loyalty than blood. Dr. Amare seated proudly in the second row beside Salvo, who had, over the past year, become something between a bodyguard and an overprotective older brother to them both. Elena wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and carried white ranunculus, the same flowers that had once arrived at her nurse's station with no card and too much meaning. Dante wore a suit instead of the dark coats she'd first known him in, and when he said his vase, his voice was steady in a way she'd only ever heard from him in the quietest, most unguarded moments of their year together. I fell into a river not expecting to live, he said, and a stranger pulled me out without knowing or caring who I was, only that I needed saving. I have spent every day since trying to become a man worth that kind of courage. I promise to spend every day left to me continuing to try. Elena, for her part, kept her vows shorter, because she had never been a woman of many words in moments that mattered most, only of action, of decisions made in an instant on a rain-soaked riverbank that had rewritten the entire shape of her life. I jumped once without thinking, she said, and it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. I'd jump again every time for you. Somewhere in the crowd, Dr. Amare wiped his eyes and pretended it was allergies. Salvo, who had never once been seen to smile in 6 years of dangerous work, smiled anyway, unguarded, watching the two people he'd spent a year protecting finally, fully safe. The Marchetti name still carried weight in the city. Old fear does not disappear in a single year, no matter how much has changed beneath the surface, but it carried something else now too, something that had not existed in that family for a generation, the quiet, hard-won proof that a person could climb out of the worst of what they'd inherited and build, instead, something worth protecting. Something worth a woman risking a swollen river to save, before she ever knew his name. Elena still worked nights at St. Agnes, still pulled people back from the edge of dying with the same steady hands that had once hauled a stranger out of the Kestrel River. Dante still ran an organization, smaller now, cleaner, aimed slowly and deliberately toward daylight. And every evening, no matter what the day had held, he called her, not out of obligation anymore, not out of fear for her safety, but simply because he wanted, more than anything else in a life that had once held so little worth wanting, to hear her voice before the night was through. It had started, after all, with a jump into dark water and a stranger's hand closing around a drowning man's wrist. It had become, in the end, the one thing in Dante Marchetti's life that no rival family, no inherited violence, no current however strong, had ever managed to pull apart.